Hello. There are many amazing Warhammer models from a great many amazing Citadel sculptors. My guest today is one of the most prolific, a legend responsible for incredible miniatures for 40k, Warhammer, Warhammer Quest, Necromunda, and especially Blood Bowl. We talk about the creation of those miniatures, what it was like to work in the Citadel studio, and how it evolved and changed over time. And of course, the creation of the famous Nagash. I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and today I'm joined by legendary Citadel sculptor Gary Morley. Gary, thank you so much for taking the time to join me. I like to start these conversations just by having a little bit of an exploration of where you first started in the hobby and within your sort of art. So where did you get started as a sculptor? What was the origin of your sculpting life?
Right. I think the actual sculpting, I mean, obviously you've heard the story of other people that they probably started as airfix toy soldiers.
Sure.
Couldn't get the right ones they wanted, and they used to swap around stuff and things. But that was being 10, 12, years old. But I'm going to kind of reverse your question a little bit. I first got into wargaming when I was about 15, 16, I think 16 properly, with a club that had just started up with some very stuffy older gentlemen who were really, really lovely and into historical wargaming. And the first wargame I ever had was American Civil War using airfix toy soldiers, not mine, and I lost.
Right.
But and that got me going. And I still couldn't get some of the figures I wanted, so I started messing about with milliput and things. But then there was a bit of a break. I was still in the hobby, doing wargaming, painting other manufacturers' figures, etc. But then around about the age of 22-ish, there was a company then called Mike's Models. Right. And I did a little bit of work for him on an English Civil War range. But unfortunately, I became ill, and that had to kind of stop. So I was off for about 6 months, and I never got back into it. I got married, children, moved. There's a lot of history in there, but
sure.
But I was always still painting figures, and ended up at about the age of 35, no, probably a bit younger than that, up a mountain in Wales, doing up an old forestry cottage and painting miniatures to get us by. Those were my hippie days. But so I was working for a company called Battle Honours, painting miniatures. I knew the twins from years ago doing reenactments, the English War reenactment stuff.
Right.
And as I was painting these Napoleonic armies for this manufacturer, he said to me one day, he said, have you ever tried sculpting? I said, well, yeah, long time ago. And he said, well, have a go with half a dozen figures. And I said, oh, okay. So I sent them to him, and he said, look, now, I won't go into the actual arrangement that he had with this other chap, but he was incredibly talented. I went off to York, visited him. I think I explained another interview how this guy did it. He used to sculpt on the back of a plate, and I knew I couldn't do that. It was incredible to see.
Right. Well, so he's literally like applying the medium to a plate and then working on that.
He would use Fimo.
Right.
On the back of an old side plate.
Right.
And he literally, in his head, he could tell where he wanted the mold line to go on this figure.
Wow.
So he would sculpt on the back of a figure and then pop that in the oven to dry the Fimo off a little bit. Then take it out, slice it off, stand it on a base, and sculpt the other side.
Wow.
I've never seen anyone else do that.
Right.
And I looked at it, and he did all this within about half an hour. And I just, not only was that amazing, it was super quick. And then he would cast his own metal tins from cold curing cast, make resin molds, and do his own cold casting. And he would those would be the Metal Masters, but he always had a reference copy of the one that he'd done.
Right.
So I went back to the company and I said, "There's no way I can do it like that. I just can't get my head around it." So anyway, I went on the traditional way. It was basically all self-taught, really. I mean, right. I kind of heard how you did it through the pipeline. I never sat down with any other sculptors. And it was just logic, really. Build a matchstick man out of wire, put him on a cork, which was happenstance, which most people do. I don't know how I came across that, and then started making some Indian Mutiny figures for this guy. Anyway, this guy, his company, he went bankrupt. He disappeared out the blue. I don't know where he went. I think he owed a lot of people a lot of money. But and then I thought, oh God, what am I going to do with all these? So a guy called Trevor Dixon, I got in contact with him and he acquired them. And then I did some work for Trevor Dixon for a while. And then I met a guy that had previously worked for Games Workshop, Max Coxhead. He'd set up his own brilliant company called Alternative Armies. I think Chaz Elliott did some work for him, I believe.
Right.
So I worked for him on a freelance basis. Still really just sort of teaching myself. I mean, oh God, I haven't got it here. I'll show you the first Milliput horse I ever did. It looks like My Little Pony. I keep it just to remind myself.
Yeah.
And then I was still interested in Napoleonics. That's one of my big historical interests. And then I thought, oh, nobody makes 1805 Russians in 15 mil. So I started making some, and I was at a show. I happened to take them with me. I didn't know I was going to bump into the twins, and I showed them this, and this is when I'm still working at Alternative Armies, or working for them, and said, "Wow, brilliant!" And they took it back the next day and showed John Blanche at work.
Right.
I think they were still at Enfield Chambers then.
Because this would have been the Perry twins, right? Alan and Michael.
87, 88, something like that.
Right.
But and I went for an interview. They called me up, went for an interview at Enfield Chambers, and they were going to offer me a job. But I went back to my then wife. We'd just finished doing up the cottage, 2 boys, and she didn't want to go. So I stayed on there. Eventually things didn't work out. Moved away and still carried on working for Alternative Armies. And then I believe I got a phone call out of the blue from John Blanche because he'd seen the stuff that I was doing at Alternative Armies.
Right.
Much to Max's dismay, I took up the job on September the 7th, 1992 at GW.
Right.
Yeah, so that's a very quick potted history, which was not actually
No, it's fascinating stuff. Well, so you'd had obviously lots of experience then working in different places, working on different kinds of miniatures, historicals, Alternative Armies, got some fantasy stuff in there as well. But what was it that you came into Games Workshop to do? Were you hired for any sort of specific ranges, or did you just turn up one day and they said, right, what have we got available?
It was it was definitely a newbie position.
Right.
New sculptor. Eyes were on me, I think. It was like, okay. I mean, they'd seen what I'd done at other Alternative. But I remember the Friday before I was going to start, I phoned up and I said, really excited about coming. Could you let me know what the first range is that I'm going to be doing? And it was Rick I was actually speaking to, and he said, well, actually, we'd like you to do some Undead. I went, oh, yeah, great. Okay, brilliant. So I put the phone down, and I'd just been speaking to somebody before the phone call saying, I hope it's not undead. All the ranges, that's the one I really don't, because any sculptor will tell you, but from back then, making a skeleton that's going to be molded in metal, you can't make it the right scale. It has to be chunky. And anyway, the first few models I did, I think it was ghouls. I might have mentioned this before, but the studio manager then, Alan Merritt, he took them off to the sales meeting, and the guys went, "What are these? These are horrible." And he came back, and bless him, I believe it was him who said, "No, let him keep going, let him keep going." So, but I was really, really excited going in every day. But and I think I learned more in 3 weeks, probably even shorter than that, than I did in all the years that I was freelancing. Right. All the tiny little tricks and tips that never occurred to me. So, yeah, that was quite eye-opening.
Yeah.
So it was Undead first. So.
Right. Because it was quite an exciting time, I imagine, for Warhammer Fantasy in particular, because obviously that had just been the release of the 4th edition, the armies books coming out, all of the sort of, as we understand them today, all the sort of modern versions of the different fantasy armies were kind of coming into their own. But do you remember who else was in the studio at the time? Who were the people who were showing you those tips and tricks and sort of helping you to get your feet under the table?
Well, the studio as a whole was at Castle Boulevard, the road just runs along the castle.
Right.
And I can't remember what it was formerly used for, but years before then it was used as a warehouse, as a docking bay, I believe, off the River Trent. But right. So it was a really characterful building, and all been done up beautifully. It was lovely. And there were different areas. White Dwarf and the painters used to sit downstairs mostly. And upstairs you'd have some game designers across the gallery where we were. And the sculptors, which was Jez, the twins, Dave Andrews, and Kev Adams at the end of the room, and myself. At that time, Trish, Colin, and Ali were working at a different place, and they were still doing Marauder, I think, or just coming to sort of the end of the Marauder thing.
Right.
I think. It's so long ago now, the time's a bit off, but they would come in occasionally, we'd see them. But so right. There wasn't many of us. And I've lost track.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. It's just who was there. I mean, I guess that is a really small team then to be working on so many games and so many ranges. Yeah. I mean, what was your sort of like sculpting time? How long did it take you to produce a couple of miniatures? Is that something you're doing in a day, in a week? What sort of processes were there?
Trying to impress, the first week I was there, the 4 ghouls took me 5 days. That's right. Probably why they weren't that good. But there was a schedule back in the early 90s. There was a schedule of what they wanted, but it wasn't really fixed in stone.
Right.
But I think you got raised eyebrows if you were taking too long over it. It was possible, I believe, that once the sculptor had finished his work, and we did work quite hard actually. I mean, it's not every day that you wake up, want to go into work and be creative. Sure. You know, I mean, I think it's a lot easier if you're excited about going in and don't really see it as a real job. You know, there's that aspect of it. But
sure.
So your enthusiasm drives you, but there are days when you think, oh God, you really can't, you know. However, that's by the by. But back in those days, once the green had left the desk, and it was going up to Eastwood, where they did all the moulding and casting at that time. The turnaround into a picture coming out in White Dwarf, 3 months.
Right. Wow.
It was that quick.
Yeah.
Not always. I think there was one occasion when it was even quicker than that.
Right.
So once it had left your desk, been moulded, cast, sat in a sales room for the guys to have a look at it there, what they were going to sell. And in between time, you get your copies back as well.
Right.
And it's a funny old thing. I think a lot of sculptors will tell you that once their green has gone off, you could get it back in a week, 2 weeks, something like that. Maybe not even that long. And you sit there and go, oh, no. It's like when you went on holiday. You'd come back and go, oh, the green fairies haven't finished it for me. And I wish I'd done this, and, you know. Yeah, the turnaround was quite quick.
Right. And were you working to sort of, so you mentioned like the ghouls were one of the first things that you were asked to do. Are you given a description? Are you given any art? Like, what's the kind of process there? Is it literally just create something and then we can describe it in the book?
I don't want to hark on too much about the ghouls because that's a very embarrassing.
Sure, or any other piece.
I will use that as an example.
Okay.
I think, and I'm going to admit something here. I think that probably Games Workshop thought, because I had been doing science fiction and fantasy figures for another company, that I knew more about Games Workshop imagery than. Right. I mean, they never asked me, but I think they just assumed I knew what all these different monsters and characters figures would be in their genre.
Sure.
Which I didn't really. Mostly, but not all the time. So presented with ghouls, I remember being told, well, we'd like 4 or 5 ghouls done. Okay. And my first question was, what is that?
Right.
And I stood back and went, you don't know what a ghoul is? Not really. I've seen different interpretations of it. Anyway, rough. So you would generally get a rough brief.
Right.
Occasionally you get a sketch. Occasionally you get John Blanche sketches, which is great. And the artists, people like Mark Gibbons, Dave Gallagher, Wayne, they would sometimes draw up some concepts. But it was a mix of both, really, I think. I've just recently seen a guy, I'll probably mention this. I know you're going to bring up Nagash, but I've just recently seen a guy do a digital copy of Mark Gibbons' artwork of Nagash. Right. And it's great. He's done a brilliant job of it. I wish I'd had Mark Gibbons' artwork before I started Nagash.
Sure.
Nagash was. Should we slide into that?
Let's talk Nagash. Yeah, I mean, because I know that.
Oh no,
I think you've been.
Yeah,
I think it's held in quite a high regard though now, Nagash. There's a lot of nostalgia for that miniature now.
I know. I think 10, 15 years ago, I got a lot of, I wouldn't say hate, but a lot of criticism for it. I mean, I know at one point, if you Googled my name, it was like worst sculptor at Games Workshop ever. Oh, Gary Morley.
Oh.
And I used to sort of, at first I thought, and then I just laugh. You just laugh at it because you know it's just half a dozen people. But Nagash was my first multi-part figure. And for a long time, I had a couple of sketches that Alan Merritt had done actually for me. He actually sketched it out in front of me. And that was great. It's good. You know, it wasn't the tightest brief in the world, but yeah, it was great. And I went over to the games designers and asked him what all his powers were and what kind of weapons he should be having and crown and things. So there was that. So I said about it. And as I say, it was my first multi-part figure. And I think apart from a chariot, I did once alternative. Anyway, so I was sitting there scratching my head, and okay, let's go. I mean, I was really excited about it. And Jez, God bless him, he was really, really helpful. He said, okay, now. And he sat me down and he said, well, that it's not going to work in one piece. You'll need to break it down into this, that, and the other. And over the course of doing it, I think it was back then, to spend 3 weeks on a figure was a long time. Okay?
Right.
Very long. Because I think it was about 6 months, possibly a little bit longer after I was working there. I know he sort of came at the end of the Undead range.
Right.
Ish. Anyway, so yeah, it took about 3 weeks, and I'd have contributions from management and what have you, and changed bits and pieces, and knew other bits weren't going to work. But eventually, I got it finished, and yes, the story is true. It was a Friday afternoon, and as I mentioned before, the sales guys used to have meetings maybe every 2-3 weeks, what they were going to release later. But the sales management, they had their say in what they felt, not from a creative point of view, but what they felt would sell,
right,
better than others or whatever. So that's the angle they were interested in.
Sure, yeah.
To be fair, we hardly got any criticism at all from them. They were like always super excited about what they were going to sell next day, which was lovely. But this one, apparently, according to my studio manager, they said they thought the head was completely horrible. So, and it didn't fit in at all. I didn't think that, people would buy it based on that. So it came back. I changed the back of the head, but I put this rather silly skull on it, and hoping that they would change their minds and go back to the original. It sounds a little bit trite and a little bit, but I mean, I just did what I was told, really. I mean, there was a little bit of a wink and a nod from my studio manager. He quite liked the original, so
yeah.
So we went back, and it, much to our dismay and mine, especially, it went through. But apparently, they sold loads. So
it must have sold loads. I feel like Nagash was everywhere during that period. Yeah.
But there were some copies of the original head knocking about. I mean, I had a couple of copies, but I'm afraid I've passed those on to much more enthusiastic people than me. But they I get people when I go to shows and events and things. They are obviously those that weren't too keen on it don't come up and say hello. Brag about the Nagash that they wish they'd never had. I very often get people coming up and saying, "Oh, I love it." And actually, over the last, I would say, 10 years, because Old Hammer has become more rejuvenated, I think a lot to do with social media, Facebook pages, and some people always sticking true to their love of metal figures.
Sure.
It's actually got a kind of fondness, and I guess it's getting a little bit rarer, maybe along the line.
Sure, yeah.
So if something can't be get a hold of, it becomes more popular.
Sure.
Yeah. But I mean, it was a struggle, I must admit. But I was actually quite pleased at the time at what I'd done.
Sure.
The first one, but I did go on to make my own version, and I sold it to a company who was owned by one of the guys. It was a young fellow that came to work at Games Workshop as a sculptor, but he left to go back and start up his own company in Spain.
Right.
Nice chap. So I did make one for myself, and he was interested in it. And then he bought the master off me, and I thought, well, it's going to get out there in the big world. But even he changed it. I mean, it looks okay. It looks all right.
I mean, one thing you mentioned there about, it was your first multi-part model, certainly not your last, But I'm curious about the actual sort of mechanical process for creating a multi-part model like that. So do you sculpt the entire thing in one go, and then literally are you cutting it into sections for it to then be molded, or do you sculpt them separately? Like, how do you actually make it?
Right. Back then, basically, the figure designers, sculptors, designers, miniature designers, various different titles, they split into two camps. There's the organic ones, and there's the straight line guys.
Right.
There's usually more of us than there are of them. And straight line, to somebody who's used to making, fluid figures all day, it's a pain, right? Because you can't get away with as many mistakes. Right. So to answer your question, I did a undead chariot. I can't remember the name of the character, but this chariot had wings up the side.
The Ark on the Black?
Yeah, could be. Yeah.
Right.
But you basically make your own rough little sketch before you start doing it. I knew it. I was told it had to have wings on the side. But apart from that, over time, the more you're trusted, the more, I wouldn't say get away with, but the more you're able to put your own creativity into it. So, yeah, basically, it was all my own thing. Probably taking influence from the previous one, but so part of the job of a sculptor, straight line designer, is knowing what will mold.
Right.
So you can't just go, okay, I'm going to make this all in one bit, give it to the mold room, they'll give it back, and you say you have to cut it up here, cut it up there. You have to know that side. You don't really have to know how to mold figures, but you have to know how they do it.
Sure.
That sounds like the same thing, but it's different. But so you know that the wheels, wheels are quite easy, really, round, and they you put them in a mold and they just go straight down. But things like the chariot itself, you'd have to break it down.
Sure.
Because you can do round bits attached to straight bits to go in the mold with pokey bits coming out the top.
Right.
So you have to understand how these things are going to lay flat in a mold. So yeah, that's part of our job. But straight line designers normally got most of that kind of work.
Right.
Dave Andrews was very good at it. A guy called Tim Adcock. We had another fella, but to a larger or lesser degree, sculptors were expected to do some of it as well.
Right.
Things like swords, that comes under, it sort of comes under kind of straight line designing, because you're cutting and sawing and filing rather than sculpting. Right. So yeah, you have to understand in your head. You do take several trips down to the mold room every so often again, just to remind yourself of how they're laying them up. And you'll know which parts will work and not work. And the mold room will definitely tell you what won't work. So it's learned by trial and error, really. Right. But things like, say, a chariot, you know that you have to cut it here, cut it there, and make it as flat as possible. A mold maker once told me his dream thing to cast is an egg-shaped figure, like an egg, basically.
Right.
So it's got no undercuts. Right. All round bits.
Because the undercuts are they're literally like where the mold would have to go in on itself almost, wouldn't it? And then when you try and remove the miniature from the mold, it's going to tear the mold apart.
It rips the rubber apart.
Right. Okay.
That's that. It's pretty low-tech stuff until later in the 90s when they discovered other molds, or the molding materials. Sorry. Right. That had a lot to do with making true scale, real life looking Lord of the Rings figures. That had a lot to do with that. It kind of forced it along the way,
Right.
which was great, really, because it had lots of benefits in the end. Because generally speaking, if you were making a figure, I can't really show you too much. I've just so happens got some. I'm doing some work on these at the moment. But generally speaking, when you sent your green down, they would come back in a bag of bits.
Right.
Right. And which was sometimes handy, because if you wanted to do a conversion on that figure, most of it don't work, was done for you.
Right.
But generally speaking, they would suffer in some way or another, and you'd have to put it back together if you're making a conversion on that figure.
And that's because of the actual process of making the molds. Right.
I once described, I can't remember what the heating is, but they heat it up to a massive amount. And the solid rubber mold, which is round, hole in the middle, it literally liquefies almost as it's with the heat going around the figure, and it pushes it all round those undercuts, which is a big no-no, because the other part of not just designing and sculpting figures, you have to know that you can't have that much of an undercut.
Right.
Okay. You can get away with a little bit, but and you'll find that some of the figures end up with things like swords and definitely skulls that are placed in very strategic places to alleviate the undercut bit.
Right.
That's why we get skulls are us is kind of workshop figures, because it works.
Was there ever like a mandate, or were you ever told to use more skulls, or was it just because it is convenient to help you get away with that kind of stuff?
We weren't told to put skulls on, but it worked.
Right. Okay.
If you had a figure doing that, say, and there was a sort of gap here, and this shoulder pad came around like that, and there was a big undercut, it was really handy to put a skull on it, because you could actually tuck it underneath and make it come in and out of mold properly.
Right. Gotcha.
But yeah, I mean, everybody joked, skulls are us. Was, a thing, not a big thing, but it was a bit of a joke. But going back to your original question, which was,
well, I was just asking about the process and the multi-part models, but I feel like you've kind of explored that. So yeah, that's great.
I mean, it would take probably an afternoon, well, a lot longer than that, to explain different aspects of sculpting a figure. I mean, you have to make them at least 10 to 20% bigger,
right?
Because they have a shrinking effect when they go through that mold.
Right.
Not as much these days, because they got different molding materials and that. And resin is, when they make figures for resin, that's a completely different process. Similar, but completely different.
Right.
You have less shrinkage, much shrinkage. But things like a spear, figures holding a spear.
Yeah.
Jez taught me this. Don't make a round one. Make a slightly oval one.
Right.
Because when it's gone through the mold, it'll probably come out round. So you just have that eye for doing those little bit exaggerated bits. That's why basically a lot of those cartoony type images of goblins and other characters as well were over exaggerated.
Sure.
Because it really, really worked in the mold.
Right.
Big thick swords, and you think, no, you never in a million years pick that up in real life, but it worked. And if you're putting something through a manufacturing process and you want to sell lots of figures, you want as least problems as possible.
Sure, of course, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, obviously, you worked on many different ranges. You worked on loads of Blood Bowl. You worked on Warhammer Quest. Some of my personal favorites, the Catacombs of Terror for Warhammer Quest. Lots of Warhammer stuff as well. But I was wondering if you had a favorite like range that you worked on whilst you were there, or a particular unit or a particular model, or was it, is it just fun stuff all over?
When we used to go to Golden Demon as guests, as sculptors, we'd sit there signing autographs. Who are you? Oh, yeah, okay. But but no, we used to love talking to the public. But that's a side issue. But could you repeat that question?
Yeah, it was just if you had a favorite miniature range or like particular model that you'd done.
Yeah, I always used to get asked that question.
Right.
And my answer straight away to people would be, it's the one I'm working on now.
Right.
And it is true with most sculptors, actually. What's your most favorite one? Because if you're having difficulty, you probably put the thing down and start again.
Right.
However, that doesn't answer the question probably. Obviously, I think I'm known for Blood Bowl. That was, once I'd got through the undead stuff, some of the undead stuff were kind of mixed in with the Blood Bowl range. I had to sort of do a bit of, I think Catacombs was an example.
Right.
It was like a little project in between. But I'm trying to scratch my head now. Time. It's funny. I can remember the rooms I did them in. But anyway.
Yeah.
But it took me 14 months to do all the Blood Bowl stuff back then, and the star players, and that was going it. That was really going it, actually. I mean, I would come in at weekends, actually, because I really, really enjoyed what I was doing. And then after then, I think I've been at Games Workshop a few years, and I think the reins had come off then. They kind of trusted me with a project. I'd obviously get some briefs, and then the schedules were beginning to get a little bit tighter. We need it by here or then. And I think elves is a thing. I don't know. I quite enjoyed doing elves. I don't know what they're a bit of a challenge sometimes, because I think people see elves as thin humanoids, so they are a bit of a challenge sometimes. But yeah, wood elves, high elves, dark elves, Eldar. I even did some Eldar.
Right.
In fact, I saw a box the other day. Going back to what we were talking about before. What they call them now, Skitari, is it? Something like that.
Sure. Well, there's the Skitari, yeah,
Eldar.
Mechanical. The Drukhari.
Drukhari.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. And it was a kill team box, and I picked it up, and I went, these are almost identical to what we did.
Yeah.
And it was me and Tim, actually. It was a really rushed job, and I wish I'd spent longer on that plastic frame. But we were given literally 3 weeks. I was going in at weekends and the evenings. But at the end result, I really enjoyed it, because it did fit the brief. Tim did all the weapons. I did all the sculpting. We worked quite closely together. And it worked within the brief. Wish we'd had more time to do a bit more detail, but they seem to have held up. I saw somebody posting some on Facebook the other day. They've got all of those sprues. So I think what's my favorite? I think I get a lot of joy out of seeing what people who bought them have done. That gives me the biggest kick about what's your most favorite stuff you've done. And I think it's the stuff that other people have enjoyed the most.
Sure.
But certainly things like Way Watchers, they were good fun. I was particularly pleased with them. There was some Dark Eldar I did that I'm not sure they all got released, actually. Generally speaking, I would say only about 2-3% of all my total figures that I worked at Games Workshop were unreleased.
Right.
And of course, all the collectors of figures, they write to you now and again. Have you got this? No. And they're worth ridiculous amounts of money. I can't believe any. But anyway, yeah, sorry.
No, it's interesting. I mean, what would cause a miniature to go unreleased? Would it it's not past the quality check, or we've changed the range? Is that the kind of reason that you wouldn't get onto shelves?
Well, the first one, the obvious, is it wouldn't work physically.
As a sculpt.
Secondly, it didn't meet the brief.
Right.
Maybe it was too late. Maybe it didn't get in the book at all and was never written about, but you got the figure. And as you know, people generally like to have, the rules to go with their figures. So those are some of the areas. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Okay, fascinating. Yeah, just on the topic of Blood Bowl again. Actually, I was going to ask you about the Golden Demon Open competition that you entered, where you created like the massive 90mm Blood Bowl player, right? I mean, what was that? Just an exercise for you, or was that like what sort of prompted creating that?
I was a massive fan of, apart from making sculpting the figures. I was a massive fan of the games. The rules are unbelievably good. Jervis did an amazing job. And at my time at Games Workshop, it was the most play-tested game I ever saw. And I've seen in a couple of other podcasts where they're describing the studio and what it was like over that year. Literally everyone got involved. There was probably, 40, 50 people at the studio at the time, different various jobs, departments. Even the girl and reception got involved. And we had a couple of big studio league tournament things.
Right.
And now this is really egotistical answer, okay? Because I'd won the second tournament, and this particular character, you've probably had it in your gaming experience as well. You're supposed to roll for the survivability of a figure or a character, and you just can't explain it. He survives everything, or she. That character just, and you're sitting there, and people are witnessing the dice rolls. Going, how did you do that? I don't know. So this particular character, Deathblow, his name is, a human blitzer. He went through the whole year, never died. Went through all the re-rolls, everything. And I started painting skulls on his, and I ran out of room on his skull for kills that he'd done. Anyway, so getting back to when was Golden Demon in those days? I think it was an April-ish time.
Right.
Anyway, I was so into this legacy character. Okay, I thought, I'm going to make a big figure, put him in the open class at Golden Demon with all the other staff members and things. Oh, brilliant, great. So this is a side note here, but alongside that, my buddy Dave Andrews was making this Bretonian joust tilt diorama.
Oh.
So I'm watching him doing this, and I'm going home and doing that, thinking, I'm going to be. So the reason why I did it was because I was just enthralled with the game, and I was showing off, really. He's gone to a better home now. Somebody else owns him. No, it was great fun. I had him on the shelves, lived in 3 other countries with me, and I just after a while you just think, well, no, somebody else give it a better home than I can. But no, it was good fun. And at that Golden Demon Open competition, Dave came first and I came second.
Well, it's an incredible piece. Yeah, it's fantastic.
I think that was the same Golden Demon year that Dave and I built this game called Formula War.
Sure, I remember it. Yeah.
I think I have one of the cars up there. It was a sort of madcap car racing game that, on first glance, would look like a tiny scale electric set. But obviously it was all orc buildings, and it was all orc car racing. We had our own little set of rules, and we took it that Golden Demon, and it was a big hit. The rules were ever so simple, really, really simple. And it was kind of based on an old chariot racing game kind of idea. We built sort of half a dozen cars each, I think. And it was just madcap. But like all those events, it's so busy in there, you're not really playing the game. You just, people have a quick go and won't be in. And the winner would, one of the admin staff at Games Workshop organised, I think it was half a dozen or a dozen baseball caps with Formula War on. I think I've still got one somewhere. We used to give that out as a prize. I remember one of the guys at Games Workshop, Andy Jones, was good friends with the guitarist from Queen, Brian
May.
Thank you. And he brought his son along. I remember him tapping me on the back of the shoulder while we were really busy, and he said, "What's it like to be famous?" And I looked at him and oh. That was funny. That was good. But yeah, that was a big hit. But they took that thing around the country because it was to different shops. Saw it 6 months later, came back in this wooden cage that didn't work, and it was busted to pieces. So there you go. Never mind. It was basically built out of cardboard and plastic. Sorry, I digressed there. But
I was fascinating. No, I love it, Gary. Yeah,
Golden Demons were brilliant. I love them,
Yeah, and the sort of big games day events. I mean, like you say, lots of special games created just for those, and really good.
10,000. We used to take
in the NEC and
and it's a pity they don't put those on like that anymore. Because I know, the Games Workshop is even more popular than it was then. And I know for a fact that people used to make a beeline for studio people. I think it was sometimes because they thought we might let slip what was coming next. But that was a big no-no. But yeah, it was a huge event.
Yeah.
Huge.
Well, actually, that does prompt a sort of further question, I suppose, Gary, just about how, during your time at Games Workshop, you felt that the organisation did change and evolve.
Oh, definitely.
So did you sort of, what was that change like from the inside? How did it sort of feel from when you first started to sort of your later stages in your career there?
Well, as I say, I joined late 92. In fact, I was speaking to somebody the other day. And we both agreed the 90s were the really fun years. And he was there in the 80s as well.
Right.
But, because, I wasn't there in the 80s, obviously, but from what I gather, all those stories and the interviews I've watched, they were just finding their way. It was like grabbing ideas. But by the time the 90s came, they knew what they were going in a direction. Okay, they might not have a release date fixed or whatever, but they had a plan. And I think the location may be Enfield Chambers to Castle Boulevard. It was a brilliant building. We were all there at one point. It was small, I'd say 40, 50 people, but everyone knew everyone. So it was, obviously people came and went, but it was always roughly the same number. And it was just a really fun place to work. Going in every day and seeing other people's work and your work and all going through the process. It was just amazing. And then obviously, like a lot of companies, they want to get bigger and expand. And then they bring in the professional bean counters, which which is no disrespect to accountants or anything. They're a necessary evil, really. But yeah, if you're going to expand, you need to do it properly. I think the 90s was still cut and fast, and a little bit from the 80s days, when people were sleeping under their desks. And I mean, I did that once when I was doing Blood Bowl. It was that late. I thought, I'm not going to bother going in there. And as an organization gets bigger, new people come in and they've got new enthusiasms. So they're always carrying on that enthusiastic endeavor, because they do make the best toy soldiers in the world. Although I think there's some competition coming up now. I mean, it's been going on for the last 5 or 6 years. However, they still do some of the best toy soldiers in the world. And it is a miniatures company. People sometimes get confused with, what Games Workshop's. It's a miniatures company, then it's a rules company, then a book, and all the other enthusiastic stuff that comes on behind it. But certainly about the time of Lord of the Rings, at that time, just before then, I had some people, some young sculptors pointed in my direction, and some of them I employed because I was given a grand title as a training miniatures manager, which it wasn't really that. It was really mentoring. It was looking after them, and pointing them sometimes in the direction of other sculptors that had different ways of doing things. Right. So it wasn't necessarily me telling them what to do. It was advice, because those guys wouldn't have been there if we hadn't have thought they'd had the skill.
Sure, yeah.
And we went through some people that had the skill, but they definitely didn't have the acumen. You can't just walk into a place and say, I've got the best ideas in the world. It just doesn't work like that. But getting back to where it changed, around about that time, Lord of the Rings came in. There was a kind of split in atmosphere in the studio. We were a tiny percentage of the sculptors that were put on it. The twins, Brian, myself, and a few of the figure painters. Alessio was doing the rules with Rick. So that was, because we had to make Lord of the Rings figures, as I said earlier, in a particular style and way, I think there was a bit of a rocky imbalance going on there, a little bit. Not realized at the time, not really understanding that.
Right.
And then, of course, at that time, just before then, I think it was 99, we'd moved from Castle Boulevard to a bigger place, and it became more I think because the studio and the manufacturing and the packing and all the other departments, mold make, all came under one roof. It didn't feel like a small little club anymore.
Right.
And it was starting to get professional. And to be honest with you, I don't think I've met anyone from the old studio that went into this grey block building with red windows that actually liked the look of it. Sure. We went, oh dear. Right. Yeah. But having said that, at the same time, we were treated very well. I would say the original core of us, but definitely by the thousands, it became a job for some people.
Sure.
Rather than, into Warhammer, they joined, and you could feel that. I think they even had, I think it was out of necessity, but we had a canteen there, and manufacturing would come up and have their hour before our hour. It was anyway, it was a different feeling. So not that I didn't enjoy it though, but and I certainly enjoyed my little role as a mentoring thing.
Yeah.
And a few of the guys are still there actually.
Yeah.
Most of them gone. I think Alex Hedstrom's still there, and I believe Mark Harrison. Used to call him Little Mark. Little Mark. I'll tell a little story. He'll get embarrassed about this. And going back to Golden Demon, he came to Golden Demon as a young 14, 15-year-old, and he would go. I think because I like the figures I sculpted, he would seek me out and he would show me something that he'd done, and I'd give him a few hints and tips, and off he'd go. And it was about the third Golden Demon that he came back, and he kept showing me every year. And then we applied for trainee sculptors, and he wrote in, and I thought, we've got to have this guy. He's so convicted to what he wants to do. And I mean, to be honest, he was rubbish at first, but he was brilliant. I mean, because going back to what I know it was like when I started, and in the end, he's a much better sculptor than me. In fact, they all are. They all are. I mean, I've never made any bones about the fact that I know I'm not the best sculptor in the world. I think I'm quite prolific. I think I've made figures that have lasted, but technically I get them right. Maybe genre wrong. Sometimes I make a couple of mistakes, but generally speaking, I'm proud of what I've done, but I know there are other guys out there. I mean, my favourite is probably Brian Nelson, actually. He's super talented.
Yeah. I mean, actually, just on the topic of the sort of change and the sort of modern sculptors, have you kept up with the sort of changing technologies? Do you do anything digitally, or do you have any views on that as it's moved into that space?
No, I'm totally old school. Still got me little green stuff.
Yeah.
Still got me milliput and me bits of wire. And and I officially retired from commissions a couple of years ago. So, one reason or another, but age-wise, officially. And I am now zeroing down on commissions. I'm just getting to the last couple of projects, which embarrassingly has taken me an awful long time. And these are projects for people that aren't manufacturers. They're just personal commissions. And they've been very patient with me. I had a little accident a few months back, which put me out for a bit. Still haven't quite got over it, but no, yeah, I still work in the old school way. And I think that's what that the people obviously want me to do stuff. That's what they want.
Yeah.
They don't want digital. Now, my views on digital, there's some really good stuff out there. But my answer is one I gave to a studio manager when we started getting in the computers for doing 3D sculpting. I was one of, I think we had 3 computers, and they were the software was about 25 grand, I remember. Because I had a little bit to do with, funny enough, the sculpting packages that came in. It was me and Brian and Tim who were the ones that actually instigated the 3D design coming into the studio.
Right.
Because bless him, the guy that was our manager at the time had a clue what it was all about. And we went to this presentation, we could see, oops, okay, time for green stuff is limited.
Right.
I mean, it took 10 years, but it got there. Yes, so we got these computers in. It's a funny sort of arm thing. It's called a haptic device, and you're sitting there with the screen in front of you, and you're making funny little shapes on the screen and going, oh, all right. No, I did a couple of figures, but not like they are now. But so my studio manager came in, and he said to me that so how are you getting on there with that? I said, yeah, it's all right. He said, sculpting well? And I said, well, it's not sculpting. That's my opinion. It's not sculpting in a traditional manner. And as I said before, I am old school, so pushing a little bit of green stuff around is sculpting. I think guys that do what they do, and somebody told me the other day, they've got 50 of these 3D guys at Games Workshop and another 30 in another department.
Right.
Wow. I mean, it was half a dozen of us. How long is it? They take 2.5 years or something?
Right.
Crikey.
Yeah. So, I mean, you sort of see it as a different, almost art form, maybe.
Definitely. Yeah.
To the sort of physical, the sculpting on green stuff and that kind of material.
Although, and I think this is where some of it's really talented. There was a guy, I was at a show a few weeks back, one called Boyle, and this fellow was showing me some figures that he'd sculpted on computer and then had 3D printed. And they looked, he had the skill of making it look like somebody had made it by hand.
Right.
I know it sounds bizarre, but I looked at it, he showed me, and I said, oh, that's really good. What do you use? He said, I use a computer. I went, wow, you didn't sculpt it. But that must be a particular skill on its own.
Sure, to almost create the maybe imperfections that you get with a physically sculpted model.
Yeah. And they were brilliant.
Right.
I mean, even I couldn't tell. Just, I mean, eventually, but couldn't tell at first.
Yeah.
But there's so many people doing it now, at home or as a business. There's so many, and there's so much choice.
Yeah.
This might actually lead into something else. I think I'm not going to make any too many future predictions, but I think we're going to go through a bit of a renaissance soon.
Right.
Going back to my early days of historical wargaming back in, I think, 71, 72. Oh my God. In those stuffy historical wargame clubs, which weren't really, they were good. You had to make everything yourself. Okay? If you wanted a hill, you went down to being cute, got your polystyrene tiles for the ceiling, made your hills out of those, buildings, cool fake packet boxes, that sort of thing. But now you can get everything you want. And I think there's a certain group of people that are going, well, we never lived in that period. We weren't around then in the 70s. And we can get all this brilliant stuff, but actually we want the stuff that we visualize. And it might not necessarily be a 2-armed, 2-legged human. It might be something they've kit bashed together. And that's pulled off a couple of spin-offs lately that I've seen. There's a game called Turnip 28, which I think is, it's a mixture of medieval and Napoleonic soldiers and daft vegetables on the table, but it works.
Yeah.
And I was at this Mini and Mates event organised by somebody locally, and I was just enthralled by what I was seeing by these people being so incredibly creative. They weren't restricted by rules of, let's face it, there shouldn't be any rules in fantasy or science fiction, but they weren't restricted by the conventional stuff, conventional looking. And what I saw on this kit bash table, about 20, 24 people, all lined up, all big plastic olds, and they're putting this, and it's daft looking. But I've got a feeling that is going to expand. That, especially with 3D printers. There's a guy in Australia, really nice guy. Can't remember his name for the life of me. He does YouTube channel stuff.
Is it Trent from Miscast?
That's Trent.
Yeah.
He comes up with the most mad-looking stuff. It's a bit like the old days when we used to have comedy sitcom programs, and then along comes Monty Python. Oh my goodness me, blows your head off. So I think we're fast approaching that, or it has been around. Maybe I've just been sat in a corner for a long while, but it is growing, I think, and I think there's some exciting things to be coming on the horizon.
Sure, yeah.
I don't want to be too critical, but the prices. I mean, I do pop into Warhammer World now and again to get the odd pot of paint and look at some of the figures that are coming out. It's like a lost love that he had years ago, you know. But I popped that there and have a look down again. And the prices are just unbelievable. I can't.
Yeah.
I mean, I know what goes into and how much it used to cost. And I see this little plastic sprue in a blister pack on a shelf.
Well, I mean, yeah, I think almost as the mainstream, and Games Workshop's definitely the mainstream of the niche of the hobby. As that mainstream grows, it also creates space for an even bigger alternative scene, doesn't it? And that independent spirit that you're talking about is so vibrant, so much cool stuff happening, and the tools exist now to do so much of it for yourself. So yeah, it is amazing. And just I suppose one final sort of talking point, I guess, is you mentioned that you're winding down in terms of commissions and sort of private miniature making. Fortunately, I feel very lucky in that I was able to get a sneaky little commission in with you before you sort of wrap that up, and you've made some familiars for me, some miniatures that I'm going to be releasing at some point in the future. That represent my sort of channel, my sorceress familiars, I guess you might say. I mean, I guess hopefully that was a fun project to work on. I thought it was amazing what you've been able to do there.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, I think there's been a couple of things in the past, but you don't very often get those commissions where you do, a magician as a mouse magician.
Yeah, no, that's right.
Yeah, no, it's good fun. Yeah, I really, really did enjoy it, actually.
I'm glad.
Generally speaking, going back to the question earlier, it's the stuff you enjoy that comes out well. Really enjoy.
Yeah.
Because you ask any sculptor whether they worked at Games Workshop, any other companies, there's going to be projects. Somebody has to do it. And they try and get the right person with the right enthusiasm, but not every day you go in and you think, oh, no, I've got to do these gibbly things.
Do you ever miss it? Do you ever miss working at GW and that time?
Do I miss?
Yeah, do you ever sort of look back fondly on that era?
Absolutely. Oh, yeah. I'm showing off again, but I think I was one of the kind of extrovert ones there, and I would get treated with trips abroad to regional games days and things. So yeah, they treat. I mean, I've got no qualms about how I was treated. I mean, I went from self-employed, and I took a £2,000 a year drop to join Games Workshop.
Right.
Every day, and I've said this somewhere else, every day we were at Castle Boulevard. You couldn't do it at Lenton because there wasn't one. But they had this little brass plaque on the back of the door, and it said Games Workshop Studio. And I know it sounds soppy and daft, and I've said it before, but I literally used to tap that thing as I went in every day. I absolutely love it. So thank you, Rick and John, and all the other management. Thank you very much. And I did actually get a marriage out of it as well, but that's another story.
Well,
yeah, good fun.
Good.
So
good.
I'm dying to see those released.
Yep. Yeah, well, hopefully not too long. Hopefully not too long until they release. But I'll show some folks the concept art that you've done, which is lovely, and people can get an idea of what we're talking about. But yeah, very much looking forward to sharing those with people as well.
Yeah, it was fun.
Great. Well, thank you, Gary, so much for sharing your memories, or some of your memories from your time at GW and your work. I don't think I'm alone in absolutely loving the work that you did there and all the sort of awesome models that you made. So, yeah, it's been real joy. Thank you.
Thanks, and thanks to everybody out there. Thank you, and subscribe. And
thank you. Huge thanks to Gary. It was absolutely awesome to chat, and I had so much fun just hearing about your experiences and your insights from behind the scenes at Games Workshop. I really, really enjoyed it, so thank you. The miniatures that Gary has sculpted for me will hopefully be available later this year alongside a short little free-to-play game that will be downloadable. I haven't yet launched my merch store. That's going to happen hopefully this year. I just need to move house first. So keep an eye on my channels and you'll find out everything you need to know all about it when the time comes. I'm really super excited. You can listen to my interviews as a podcast if you search for In Conversation with Jordan Sorcery wherever you get your pods. Of course, there is the new channel, Jordan Sorcery Pods, on YouTube, where you can find all of my long-form conversational content, including the GW Films Club and the GW Books Club as well. And if you would like to support the work that I do here, please consider checking out my Patreon. You'll get access to regular updates, an exclusive Discord, and until the end of this year, monthly giveaways. It is an enormous help and I greatly appreciate it. Thank you once again to Gary. Thank you for listening and watching. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery.